Picture, if you will, a desert. Chances are the picture you now have in your head probably looks a lot like Namib-Naukluft National Park in Namibia. Among the oldest deserts in the world, this park features a spectacular erg, or sand sea, of towering golden red sand dunes rolling off as far as the eye can see, one of which, known as Dune 7, is the largest in the world at a whopping 380 meters or 245.25 Ariana Grandes tall. Standing amid this desolate, sun-baked landscape, you would expect to be confronted by a profound silence broken only by the soft whistling of the wind. But this is no ordinary desert, for every so often, the silence will be shattered by a deep, powerful roaring sound, variously likened to thunder, distant drums, or the drone of a low-flying propeller aircraft. But alas, for all you Dune fans out there, this ominous sound does not herald the approach of the giant sandworm, Shai-Hulud, bless the maker and his water, but is instead produced by the sand itself. Such singing sands are surprisingly common, appearing in deserts and on beaches around the world, from Morocco to Kazakhstan, Scotland, Canada, and Hawaii, and have been the subject of myth and folklore for centuries. Yet despite decades of scientific investigation, to this day, no one is quite sure what causes these sands to sing. This is the story of one of the last great mysteries of the natural world. To begin with, singing sands have been known to humanity for thousands of years. In his influential 1300 travelogue, Book of the Marvels of the World, Venetian merchant and explorer Marco Polo described invisible desert spirits which, at times, fill the air with the sounds of all kinds of musical instruments and also of drums and the clash of arms. Such natural sounds are thought to have inspired the jinn, or genies of Arabian folklore, and references to singing dunes appear in the 1001 Nights and 9th century AD Chinese literature. Half a century later, British naturalist Charles Darwin also mentioned singing sands in his 1839 chronicle, Voyage of the Beagle. Leaving Brazil during the 2 first days, we retraced our steps. It was very wearisome work, as the road generally ran across a glaring hot sandy plain not far from the coast. I noticed that each time the horse put his foot on the fine siliceous sand, a gentle chirping noise was produced. While in 1858, Scottish geologist Hugh Miller describes witnessing the phenomenon on the Isle of Eigg. I struck it obliquely with my foot where the surface lay dry, which elicited a shrill, sonorous note. I walked over it, striking it obliquely with each step, and with every blow the shrill note was repeated. More recently, singing sands have found their way into many works of popular culture, including Bing Crosby's 1947 song The Singing Sands of Alamosa, inspired by Great Sand Dunes National Park in Colorado, and of course, Frank Herbert's classic 1965 sci-fi epic Dune. Today, at least 31 singing or booming deserts and beaches have been identified around the world, many of which are popular tourist attractions. Singing sands are also thought to exist on other celestial bodies. Indeed, such vibrations have been proposed as an explanation for the mysterious moonquakes recorded by instruments left on the lunar surface by the Apollo 11, 14, 15, and 17 missions. These mysterious seismic events begin abruptly 2 days after lunar sunrise, continue uninterrupted throughout the lunar day, and abruptly cease at sunset. According to a theory proposed by American geophysicist David Criswell in 1975, these quakes originate in Cone Crater, where thermal expansion driven by solar heating causes lunar dust, or regolith, to slump off the crater walls and slide to the bottom, creating vibrations that travel through the lunar crust. Of course, as the moon has no real atmosphere, these sounds are inaudible to astronauts. However, this theory has been called into question, as the sheer volumes of regolith needed to produce the seismic energy recorded would cause the interior of Cone Crater to fall below its angle of repose, the angle at which a given granular material can be piled without slumping within 100 years, an impossible scenario given the crater is at least 30 million years old. In any event, being so widely scattered, unsurprisingly, the world's singing sands vary widely in their geology, composition, and behavior. However, researchers typically group them into just 2 categories based on frequency range. The more common, squeaking or whistling sands, which produce short bursts of sound at around 500 Hz when stepped upon, and the rarer booming or roaring sands, which produce more extended noises in the 50 Hz range, typically when wind blows through them or a block of sand sloughs off the side of a dune. While both types of sand produce a wide range of frequencies simultaneously, these are typically confined within a surprisingly narrow band, often making them sound like a single pure tone. These sounds can also be astonishingly loud, reaching upwards of 105 decibels, about the same as a chainsaw, and audible up to 10 kilometers or 6,232.13 Ariana Grandes away. However, why these two types of sand differ in their behavior, or indeed what causes the sound in the first place, is still poorly understood, though certainly not from lack of trying, because scientists are gonna scientist. The first such individual to extensively study singing sands was American chemist Dr. Henry Carrington Bolton. In an 1889 paper titled Researches on Musical Sand in the Hawaiian Islands and in California, Bolton observed that compared with other types of sand, singing sands feature grains which are unusually spherical, smooth, and well sorted, that is, of roughly uniform size. Later studies have identified two more requirements for sound production. The grains must be between 0.1 and 0.05 millimeters in diameter and composed mainly of quartz or other silica minerals. Indeed, the range of frequencies produced appears directly linked to the distribution of grain sizes within the sand. In a 2012 study, a team of researchers at Paris Diderot University, led by Simon de Gaux-Bohoy, recorded the sounds produced by dunes in Morocco and Oman, then transported 150 kilograms of that sand back to their laboratory for analysis. They found that the Moroccan sand, which produced an almost pure 105 Hz tone, had grains of almost uniform 160 micrometers, while the Omani sand, which produced a range of frequencies from 90 to 150 Hz, had an equally broad grain size distribution ranging from 150 to 30 microns. And when the researchers sifted the Omani sand down to only 200 to 250 micron particles, the tone cleared to a single pure frequency. Based on his observations, Bolton theorized that the singing was caused by thin layers or cushions of air clinging to the surface of each grain, which vibrate when the grains slide past one another, rather like wetted fingers sliding on the rim of a wine glass. To support his theory, Bolton pointed out that such sands cease to sing when wetted, but resume when dried out. Indeed, as little as 0.1% humidity can seriously affect sound production in booming or roaring desert sands, with the phenomenon disappearing entirely above 1% humidity. Squeaking or whistling sands are also sensitive to moisture, but not to the same extent as booming sands, with some types of squeaking sand being capable of producing sound even when submerged in water. Nonetheless, most squeaking sand is found in the upper, drier reaches of beaches where the moisture content is lower rather than closer to the tide line. Furthermore, the singing effect is intensified when the sand is washed then dried out. This, he argued, cleansed the sand of smaller particles which would interfere with the resonance of air cushions. This would explain why squeaking sands are not commonly found more than 30 meters from the tide line. Sand beyond this is not regularly washed by the waves and thus accumulates impurities that hamper its singing abilities. The air cushion theory proved highly influential and is still widely cited in popular science books and tourism material for singing beaches and dunes. However, it has since been thoroughly debunked. For example, in 1975, American geophysicists David Criswell, John Lindsay, and David Reasoner measured the mechanical vibrations produced by singing sands at both regular and very low atmospheric pressure of around 200 pascals, or 1.5 millimeters of mercury. This reduction in pressure had no effect on the vibrations measured, proving that the singing effect cannot be produced by air cushions. Instead, it must be caused by the grains physically rubbing against each other. This theory was first put forward in 1891 by British politician and amateur geologist Cecil Carus Wilson, but was immediately met with criticism by physicist John Henry Poynting, who in 1908 calculated that if the singing was produced by the resonance of individual sand grains, then the frequencies produced would be in excess of 1 megahertz rather than the 50 to 500 hertz actually observed. Instead, in 1922, Poynting and fellow physicist J.J. Thomson, most famous for discovering the electron, posited that the sound is produced by large sheets of sand grains shearing past one another, allowing lower frequencies to be generated. Their theory was based on the principle of dilation, the expansion a granular substance experiences when subjected to shear force. For example, when you step onto wet sand at the beach, the sand directly beneath your foot compresses, squeezing out the water between the grains. Simultaneously, the sand immediately around your foot expands, creating more space between the grains into which the displaced water can drain. Poynting and Thompson posited that when a shear force is applied to the sand, causing one layer of grains to slide over another, some regions of the upper layer must necessarily dilate to allow the movement to happen, with grains at the interface lifting up out of their interstices, the spaces between grains sliding over the grains below and dropping into new interstices. If the applied shear forces were reasonably constant, the grains of sufficiently uniform size and shape, the pair argued, then this compression dilation would be roughly periodic in time and produce regular oscillations at the frequencies commonly encountered. But while seemingly a step in the right direction, Poynting and Thompson's model of granular flow was overly simplistic and their theory of sound formation fundamentally flawed. For example, the theory depended on a uniformity of grain size and shape not actually found in nature. Furthermore, it predicted that the frequency of the sounds produced should be dependent on grain size and shear rate alone. However, this fails to explain why the frequencies produced by squeaking or whistling sands are typically 5 to 10 times higher than those produced by booming or roaring sands at the same shear rates, despite both having an average grain size of around 300 micrometers. Finally, thanks to more sophisticated flow models for granular substances, we now know that if sand starts to shear along a thin layer, increasing shear stresses along the surface is more likely to create additional shear planes parallel to the first one, rather than increasing the rate of shear along that original plane. This theory also falls apart when applied to booming or roaring sands, which tend to shear in layers several centimeters thick. So, back to the drawing board, or sandbox as it were. The next major figure in our story is by far the most interesting, Brigadier Ralph Alger Bagnold, an officer in the British Army Royal Engineers. A prolific desert explorer and geologist, in 1932, Bagnold completed the first recorded east-to-west crossing of the Libyan desert, and in 1941 published the book The Physics of Blown Sand and Desert Dunes, a seminal work drawn from field observations and laboratory experiments using a wind tunnel. He also invented a new type of sun compass for use in areas where large deposits of iron ore made regular magnetic compasses unreliable. However, Bagnold is probably best remembered for founding and commanding the Long Range Desert Group, or LRDG, during the Second World War. In a regular unit of the British 8th Army in North Africa, the LRDG used specially modified trucks and jeeps to carry out long-range reconnaissance and sabotage raids deep behind German and Italian lines. Their success later inspired the creation of the legendary Special Air Service, or SAS. Bagnold was thus an expert in desert geography and the perfect person to tackle the mystery of the Singing Sands, and to learn more about another 1930s desert explorer who worked for the Axis and whose life became the subject of many myths and legends, and an Academy Award-winning 1996 film, please check out our previous video, The Real-Life English Patient. But in any event, in a revised edition of The Physics of Blown Sand and Desert Dunes, published in 1954, Bagnold described a series of simple experiments involving shaking a sample of booming sand in a jar. He discovered that a certain amount of shear force was required to sustain the booming sound, equivalent to the weight of around 8 centimeters of sand. This roughly corresponds to the thickness of the layers that slough off the side of Singing Dunes, indicating that the weight of the sand grains in these layers is just enough to sustain the shear force needed to produce the required oscillations. To help model the behavior of these layers, Bagnold introduced the concept of dilation, or lambda, a dimensionless unit equivalent to the ratio between the average surface-to-surface separation between grains and the average grain diameter. In his experiments, Bagnold discovered that at values above lambda equals 17, sand behaves like a solid, resisting sliding or slumping even at steep angles. Below lambda equals 17, however, sand begins to behave like a non-Newtonian fluid. That is, its viscosity changes in response to applied stress. You're probably familiar with such fluids in the form of oobleck, a mixture of cornstarch and water that flows normally when poured, but suddenly hardens when squeezed, struck with a hammer, or otherwise subjected to stress. And below around lambda equals 14, the grains become too widely spaced to transmit shear forces, and sand starts to behave like a regular Newtonian fluid, losing all resistance to shear. Bagnold also observed that at lambda values between 14 and 17, beyond a certain dynamic friction angle, or angle of repose, sand begins to slough off the side of dunes in thin sheets. Now, if you paid attention in high school physics, you will recall that any object moving at a constant velocity is subject to balance forces in all directions. In the case of sliding sand, the sliding is balanced by an equal and opposite force along the plane of shear caused by the collisions between moving sand grains in the sheet and stationary grains below. The vertical force component of the sand, caused by its weight, is also balanced by an equal and opposite force from below. However, Bagnold argues if the sliding sheet attains a velocity in excess of its preferred velocity, a large increase in vertical dispersive stress must be produced to compensate. This, in turn, causes the entire sheet to be lifted up at once. The sheet then immediately collapses under its own weight, and the whole process repeats, causing the whole sheet to oscillate vertically and generate sound. This is equivalent to a rosin bow sliding over a violin string. The rosin causes the bow to intermittently stick and release, causing the string to vibrate. Bagnold then also applied these principles to squeaking or whistling sands. However, as compression, such as from footsteps, subjects such sand to greater acceleration than sliding or slumping, the emitted frequency, Bagnold predicts, must necessarily be higher. While outwardly similar to John Poynting and J.J. Thomson's theory from 1922, Bagnold's model was more physically and mathematically complete. However, it too proved fundamentally flawed because nature doesn't want us to have nice things. For example, according to Bagnold's equations, sand sheets with a mean grain size of 30 microns should vibrate at a frequency of 240 Hz, well above the observed at real booming or roaring dunes. Furthermore, Bagnold's theory only predicts the production of a single frequency and does not account for the multiple tones produced by real singing sands. And finally, later experiments have determined that the frequency of the booming decreases linearly with increasing grain size, rather than with the square root as Bagnold predicted. However, Bagnold's models do predict the behavior of squeaking or whistling sands far better than that of booming or roaring sands, though just why this isn't fully understood. Indeed, according to Bagnold's model, all singing sands should be capable of both squeaking and booming, but this is very rarely the case. In most instances, squeaking sand can't boom and vice versa. But there are a few exceptions, as Henry Bolton observed in 1889. The sand of the Hawaiian Islands possesses the acoustic properties of both classes of places. It gives out the same notes as of Egypt when rolling down the slope, and it yields a peculiar hoot-like sound when struck together in a bag, like the sands of Eigg, Manchester, Massachusetts, and other sea beaches. Some researchers have also succeeded in making some squeaking sands boom and some booming sands squeak in a laboratory setting using what methods we don't like to think about, but this phenomenon requires considerable more investigation. Undeterred, in the 1966 edition of The Physics of Blown Sand in Desert Dunes, Bagnold proposed an alternate explanation for singing sands: piezoelectricity, the ability of certain substances, particularly in the mineral quartz, to produce an electrical charge when subjected to mechanical stress. This effect is widely exploited in devices like butane lighters and barbecue igniters. The opposite phenomenon, in which applying an electrical current to a piezoelectric material causes it to oscillate at certain frequency, also has a myriad of applications, being the basis for all quartz watches and other timepieces. According to this theory, the stresses produced by quartz sand grains sliding past each other generate small electrical fields around each grain, which interact with each other to produce oscillations and sound. This idea was inspired by the work of A.D. Lewis, who conducted extensive geological investigations of southern Africa's Kalahari Desert in the mid-1930s. While pouring booming sand from the Kalahari out of a jar, Lewis observed that the sand generates its own electrical charge, causing grains to stick to the sides of the jar and clump together into filaments up to a few centimeters long. If true, this theory would neatly explain why moisture so easily interrupts the singing effect, as water would impede the formation of electrical fields. Unfortunately, however, this theory has also largely been debunked. Lewis himself noted that even non-singing sand can produce its own electrical charge, and that grinding singing sand down to smaller grain sizes had no effect on its electrical output. Furthermore, he reported being able to induce booming or squeaking in ordinary sodium chloride or table salt crystals, which are not piezoelectric. Indeed, the sands of Barking Sands Beach in Hawaii, one of the most famous singing beaches in the world, contain no quartz or other piezoelectric materials at all, being entirely composed of calcium carbonate, aka limestone, from ground-up seashells. These grains are also far larger and more irregular than that of most singing sands, further muddying the waters. While dozens more researchers researchers have tackled the problem over the last half-century, science is surprisingly little closer to cracking the mystery of the singing sands. What is known is that singing sand grains tend to be A. composed of quartz, B. well sorted, C. have a low moisture content, D. be particularly rounded with few protrusions or irregularities, and E. be particularly smooth and well polished. Indeed, the importance of surface smoothness in sound production has been demonstrated in experiments using artificial sand made of tiny glass spheres, which squeak far louder than natural singing sand. The smoothness requirement is also supported by the fact that singing sands are typically only found in areas where they can be gradually rounded and smoothed by erosion over a long period of time. For example, as mentioned before, singing beach sand is usually only found within a narrow band close to the shore, where the sand grains can be rounded and sorted by wave action before being deposited on the upper beach to dry and reach the ideal moisture level. Similarly, desert booming sands are typically found long distances from their original sources, indicating that long-range transport is required to round down and sort the sand grains into the ideal conditions for sound production. They are also typically found in particularly old sand dunes, where their long residency allows them to attain similar characteristics. However, not all singing sands share these required characteristics. For example, the sand grains at Mingsha Shan in Dunhyang, China have highly irregular and pitted surfaces, as do those at Hawaii's Barking Sand Beach. And as mentioned before, the grains at Barking Sand Beach contain no quartz. Furthermore, squeaking has been produced in ordinary table salt, which has cube-shaped crystals, while some singing sands can sing even when submerged in water. And the list of inconsistent and frustrating exceptions goes on and on. While one day geologists, chemists, physicists, and other experts may finally crack the problem, for now the eerie singing sands remain one of the great unsolved mysteries of the natural world.